Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our Startup Genome global webinar today on the topic of COVID-19 impact insights, quantifying the impact of the crisis on your startups and their recovery. We had our first webinar today with our member in Sri Lanka, ICTA from the national government. And today we are very fortunate enough to have our member from Montreal here with us today, Patrick Gagne.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. Next slide. Thank you. So today, we will be taking you through an introduction and really honing on why is this important and very much why is this important right now. So we'll be going through how we as Startup Genome support ecosystems globally through our work on COVID-19 impact insights. We'll be explaining as well our global peer learning and membership, how we support ecosystems globally. We'll be hearing from Patrick Gagne on what's the impact of our work and collaboration together, and then ending with an open question and answers. Next slide. So the purpose of our webinars is really to highlight specific tangible topics for ecosystem acceleration in order to produce sustainable ecosystem growth globally. So us, the Startup Genome, and our partners support ecosystems all over the world. And in these 1 hour sessions, we will be detailing more practically how we do this. For all of our ongoing webinars, we would really love to hear your feedback of topics that are most important to you as ecosystem builders, as policy leaders from around the world. Previous topics that we've covered pertain on funding policy to support startups and scale-ups, as well as attracting best talent and international resources, so globally positioning your ecosystem. And on August 26th, we invite you all to join us where we will be focusing on multiplying ecosystem growth and policy impact, a data-driven assessment and prioritization of gaps to build your ecosystem strategy. So there'll be many more to come over the next months and years. So stay updated on our webinar page. This is linked here, but everyone attending will receive all the presentation slides after the webinar today. Next slide. So without further ado, I would love to invite JF, our founder and CEO here at Startup Genome, to kick us off for today's webinar in collaboration with our member, Patrick Gagne, the CEO of OSMO and co-CEO of Bonjour Startup Montreal. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to our CEO at Startup Genome.
Thank you, Adam, and welcome everyone. It's always great to connect on those very important issues that are taking even more importance right now. And you know, we help in many ways, and today we'll talk about one of the ways we can help you really understand and quantify the current issues, the risks for your ecosystems, but also help you align with your colleagues and your leaders in other organizations, which is really one of the big roles we play, is bringing a lot of data so that you can lead the discussion, lead the story, and bring other organization leaders, the investors, the universities, the other ministries, the corporations, the startups with you as you define what the problems are and then what are the solutions. So I always like to start with the top level. Of course, the startup economy has grown super fast and is now, last year was worth $2.8 trillion. That's our sum of ecosystem values, if you will, for those that are familiar with how we calculate that, the exits plus the value of all the startups. And it's been growing about 10% a year, which means 3 to 4 times faster than our economies. But when we look at the COVID impact, it's really disastrous. And for our fellow startups, right, it's really tragic to see that only 26%, if you look at the bottom, are still growing during the COVID crisis. And it's not normal because usually all startups are growing. Some might be growing fast, slowly, but everybody is usually pretty much growing or stable. Startups are made to grow, and it's rare that they go down. But here you can see that actually 74% of the startups are experiencing a drop in revenue, and that means also, as they're burning cash by definition, that they're really in the red zone. We see that 40, 50, 65% have less than 6 months worth of cash. That's including seed, or normally have less cash. But even if we look at only Series A, it's more than 30% of the startups have less than 6 months of cash. And this has been impacting them not only with their cash at hand, but also raising money. We saw that when we asked that many of their discussion to get new funds have been stalled. Even they start well, even if they got a term sheet, some I've seen their term sheets canceled or stop progressing. And this is the result in terms of closing of Series A plus rounds by the startups. And we saw in China a rapid, dramatic drop of 74%. And it's gone up a little bit since then, but the biggest worry for all of us is the second wave. Right? As we enter the recession, the Series A continue to flow as the VC funds still have dry powder, but they're unable to raise new funds. As soon as these current funds will be depleted, we'll see a big drop in Series A. This is the line for the last crisis, the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and we saw a drop of 30 to 46% in the US, a really resilient VC market, 33 to 46% of Series A's and Series B's. So this is, where we are now turning our attention, the next gap in funding. And, a lot of people talk about the winners, and we saw on the first slide that there's only 26% of, and they're not really winners because, if I go back to the first slide and I look at the bottom, the 14% that are growing 1 to 10%, this is normal. This is not winners, right? Some of the 12% might be growing extraordinarily fast, but it's very small minority. And we talk about subsectors and think, some of those subsectors are going very well. But on average, all subsectors have seen a decline in revenues. And that's reverse of what it should be. Right? Again, startups should be growing on average. All of them should be on average growing. Cybersecurity is the least affected, but still minus 14%. Of course, we know the ones that are directly affected by COVID, travel and tourism, minus 70%. But if you look at this curve, you can see, right, even enterprise solution, minus 32%. The corporations are preparing for a recession, and they're stopping, their purchase of new products. So this is very important now to save your startup ecosystem, so that, in a year or two, you don't lose 30, 40, 50% of your startup ecosystem that you have been working on building for the last 10 years. Right? The other reason is, of course, that the tech industry, the tech sector, is really a engine of economic recovery. When we look at this is for the US, but the same thing applies in Europe and Asia. The computer system design related services, which is the old naming from our statistics that captures the tech internet businesses. And you can see that it's very resilient. Through the recession, it kept growing, and it grew the fastest out of the recession. And health, we always talk about health being resilient. It's true, but we can see a smaller growth during the recession and then a much slower growth out of the recession. So this is the engine of recovery for everybody. A lot of people, a lot of economists have said, the tech industry was really the one that led us out of the recession. I think this is not the only one that led us out of the recession, but it's definitely an important engine. And as we looked in the past, a lot of people have been betting on traditional R&D, but corporations lower their R&D during recession. And throughout the last 10 years, we see a shift where traditional R&D is no longer able to shoulder economic growth. So those really leading economies at R&D, the Seoul, the Taiwan, that used to be the fastest growing economies around the West, the developed economies, 10, 15 years ago, have slowed down and now are seeing the need to develop what we call an ambidextrous innovation ecosystem. Tangible IP on one side and business model innovation, disruptive innovation on the other one. And those economies that have developed both, like Silicon Valley, Toronto, you can see how they're the new leaders in economic growth. So develop in, we really talk about, it's not the fourth industrial revolution. It's not about technology, tangible IP. It's really about the global startup revolution, those disruptive business model innovation, right? Except for Google, Facebook, Amazon, they did not start with patents, Alibaba, Tencent. They started with just a neat idea of a new way to sell e-commerce or to develop a social network. No patent, no tangible IP. But this global startup revolution has now produced 5 of the top 10 largest corporations in the world. And this has never happened. We went back 100 years, and telecom has never had produced more than 3 of the top 10. Computers, automotive, no more than 3. And we have 5, and that's without counting Microsoft and Apple, which is really from the computer industry. But if you counted them, there will be 7. Right? But we're talking here about this new concept, this new powerful industry, if you will, of us working together in a startup ecosystem to produce large corporation. And that's new, and that's what produced the Amazon, Google, Facebook, Alibaba, and Tencent. And so what makes the startup ecosystem produce more scale-ups is, bigger ecosystem are important. And that's why then saving a lot of your startups is important, because if it shrinks, it's going to be less productive in producing scale-ups. But resources, right? So keeping your talent, keeping your funding. And you can see local connectedness, global connectedness. These are the knowledge network and the people working together at local and the global level. When you look at bigger and better, it's extremely clear that larger ecosystem and number of startups here at the x-axis produce more and more ecosystem value. It's accelerating with size. So it's really important to save a lot of your startups, not only your scale-ups, but also your Series A and your seed and your pre-seed startups, because they're the future. And when they die, you might think that you lose some not very productive startups, but you're basically shrinking your community. That in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, they cannot be replaced. When we look at also the size of the startup ecosystem, or the funding of the startup ecosystem, seed-funded startups is where it starts. Fast growth. Those that get funded start accelerating, and they become the powerful Series A and the Series B startups. And we can see an extraordinary, clear link between the number or the ratio, the proportion of your startups that get seed funded versus your rate of exits. So it's the beginning of the funnel towards exits is your seed fund. So if this drops, and we know angel investment drops during recession, then in 4 years, in 5 years, you'll see a lot fewer exits and that means that's a great proxy for job creation and economic growth. So if you want this engine to continue, you need to save it. But yet, when we look back, we looked at 247 Series A startups in all of the US in 2005 and 6 to see what 2006 and 7 to see what happens to them. And those that got refunded in 2008 and 9, and those that got first Series A in 2008 and 9, saw for those investments during recession, saw a higher multiple of a money investment to exits. So it's a great time to invest when we look at the return on investment for the VC funds of that vintage year of just before the recession. So those that are now Series A and need more funds, but also during recession, if we look at 2008, it was 15%, 2009. So these new investments that you're going to help the VCs and the angels make actually have paid a higher return than those before the recession, 2 years, 3 years before. So it's a great time for investors to invest. They're going to have higher return or has high returns, but yet the private sector always contract their investment during recession. And that's what the government is there for, is to replace the private money so that the startups survive and continue to thrive. we had a study by Dane Stengler was saying half of the unicorns were created during recession. So it's a great time, yet private sector will contract, we know that. And when we look at the investment of saving traditional SMEs versus startups, we see that the cost per job saved is actually much lower in startups if you invest through equities, because you get a return. If you get a positive return, then the money invested by the government in a fund of funds, for instance, is at no cost because you get a return. Even if you assume a 10% a year negative return, it still costs less to save Series A startups. Series A startup jobs that are about exports, that are sustainable, they're not going to die because they're innovative jobs, and startups jobs that are really an engine of recovery. And what we want you to prepare for is not only saving those ecosystems, but also the fact that actually entrepreneurship increases during a recession. There's this Kaufman study that was done actually by Arnobio Morelix, who is our Chief Innovation Officer, shows that there's a really clear growth of entrepreneurship during recessions. Great people, great employees lose their job, and you think, this great idea I've had for a few years, I'm going to just do it now. I have time. I'm on unemployment insurance, or I'm without a job. I'm going to create my own job. So getting ready to harness this energy that goes into entrepreneurship after years of usually lower and lower entrepreneurship as good paying jobs abound. Now, are you ready to create programs and funding and all the resources around those new entrepreneurs so that they jump in and they succeed? So if funding retracts, the opposite can happen. All of this energy, new energy in entrepreneurs is basically lost because they cannot get funding, they cannot get support. So we need to get ready for that. And a lot of, traditionally we've been focusing a lot on corporations, right? Restarting after the recession to hire. But what we show here, again, a study by Kaufman and Arnobio when he was there, we see that the pink or red area is much bigger than the two green areas. So that means across a complete economic cycle, large corporations, old corporations are net destroyer of jobs. And you can see all of them, right? The 6 to 10-year-old, the 11 to 15-year-old companies, they're all net destroyers of jobs across economic cycles. The only firms as a group that create jobs and are resilient in doing so across the recessions, across economic cycle, is the young firms, the 0 to 5 years. They create new companies and they create new jobs. And of course, those that grow the fastest create 80% of those jobs. Right? They're the fast growth, high-tech companies that are successful. So looking at your ratios, you can see that, here we have early globalization. I think many of you are familiar with our life cycle phases. The early globalization, the startup ecosystem that are between 800 to 1,200 startups produce scale-ups at a lower rate than the late globalization ones, those that are more startups. Again, it's bigger is better in creating scale-ups that will produce jobs. But it varies a lot, the scale-up production, right, across all the cities. So, and then when you're developing those arguments to create those investments, we can be there for you. Here, this is a study that I think we did for Rhineland or Kuala Lumpur. They're similar. I think this is for Rhineland, where we show that the economic value in investing in the ecosystem in the right way, right, creates 8 billion in economic values within a few years, 11 billion if we go a little bit more aggressive, and creates 100,000 jobs. And this is an investment that was, several $1 million, not a lot, but invested in the right way with the right policies. So it's really time to act to save the ecosystem. And in funding, you have first, right, a zone of gap here, funding gap at the beginning that just happened, and a zone of gap that's going to happen where a lot of startups can die. And so this is the death of startups that raise money 9 to 24 months earlier, but it's too early to pick winners because in COVID, everything has changed, and we don't know if the past winners will continue to be winners and the past losers will continue to lose. In fact, we already know it's not true. Right? EdTech was a not a very good subsector 6 months ago, but now it's hot. Right? All the elementary schools, all the colleges, all of the high schools have experienced online learning and are ready to use tech to support their operations. So now EdTech is hot. And here you have the death of startups that should have normally get funded, but in Series B here, but there's not enough cash. You know, the VCs have been disrupted in their operations, and they cannot fund the startups. And so here you want to really infuse cash into fund of funds and other incentives, and maybe, as Israel did, bring incentive for large pension plans to inject money to replace the government. So if the government cannot inject money because you don't have enough cash, then how do you create incentives and new structures to attract a pension plan with their large capital into VC funding, VC funds? So this is important. And you know, we've seen this over and over again. The startup ecosystem are extremely concentrated, and that means we're working with you to help you flatten this curve. And if you don't do anything, right, this curve is going to become even more steep, where the best startups will always find funding in San Francisco and New York and London. You don't want them to move, you know, in order to find funding. You need to continue to support them. Don't let your investments of the last several years die. So that success can happen everywhere. So what we do for you is, you know, if you're ready, it's a bigger product, of course, is, you know, how do we develop those strategies that are more complete across many success factors? And we have products from first monitoring the trends, which is the Ecosystem 360 monitor. We have the in-depth assessment and benchmarks that we do. Then we prioritize gaps based on these assessments and develop acceleration strategies and bring experts to do that with us. But COVID-19 has drastically affected the global startup ecosystems. Adam, did you want to continue on this?
Yep. So so from today, what we are focusing on is our COVID-19 impact insights. We work to really quantify the impact of the crisis on your startups and in saving and throughout the recovery as well, tracking throughout the recovery. So next slide.
Well, maybe I'll talk about the COVID impact insight. So we've seen this. That's important to save the startups. Do you want to go through the methodology? Sorry.
You can.
Yeah. So what we do with the COVID impact insight is really doing a survey and plus a secondary research to quantify the impact on your startup ecosystem. So survey of founders, analysis of the responses to critical questions, looking at funding, looking at layoffs of employees, so really loss of talent and shedding of talent, and looking at their so revenue, funding, and employment. And so we develop this with our industry experts and our expertise. But of course, our strength is about deploying this survey really rapidly and efficiently, get a high response rate, but also bringing benchmarks. So you see, you know, the context, because as we know, if your startup ecosystem see a drop of 20% in revenue or in employment, and you don't know how the other ones are doing, you actually don't know if it's good or bad, right? Are the other ones dropping 40% and therefore 20% is good? Or are the other ones dropping 10%, therefore you're twice as bad at 20%? So this context, these benchmarks are extremely important. So we look at funding, so the shortfall of access to capital that we've talked about earlier, the talent, so seeing how much employees are shed, what type of employees, and oftentimes, you know, we think, you know, you shed employees, rehire, but in a startup, taking 3 months to shed employees and taking 3 months to rehire is a lifetime for other companies. And you have a year and a half, 2 years to prove yourself. You lose 6 to 9 months to shed, rehire, retrain, and you're basically almost dead. So this is very important when we see those layoffs. This is a critical factor to consider, and that gives you argument to really act. And the market impact, right? Customer growth, revenue growth. So we look at the subsector level also, so you can understand how is it different for EdTech, for FinTech, for others. We look at the extent of the cost-cutting measures and operational forecasts and their intent looking forward. And then we look at also their reaction on policies. What policies would they like? Did the policies already acted were useful for the startups? Because oftentimes we act for young companies that includes traditional SMEs and startups, and sometimes it doesn't hit the mark with startups because they have different needs. So we give you then a live dashboard where in real time you can see your results. So it's in Tableau, you can click, and as the survey comes in, you can see the results. So it's really high velocity. And then we give you a final report in presentation format, so you can use the slides very quickly with your colleagues, your teams, and other organizations, so that you can bring everybody together around the right metrics and the right measures, and then start talking about actions that need to be taken. And of course, then we look at not only the benchmarks of all the other ones are doing, but also we've looked at best practices, the policies that have been enacted by others. So this is an example of the live dashboard where you see by subsector what are the answers, and by target customers of those startups. We look at the month of runway that they have left, and you can look at it by Series A, by seed. We look at the change of labor. So you can see here 46% of the startups have laid off 1 to 20% of their employment, 7% closed down, and you can see the distribution. So it's easy to see what is the impact, but also if we take New Zealand, you can see how you compare to others. So New Zealand compared to the rest of Oceania and the rest of the world. And you can see New Zealand has acted very quickly and is actually doing better. Right? So fewer have paused. Some are affected significantly, but fewer are more are unaffected than the rest of the world. So they're doing a little bit better. Their change of revenue is also better. You see more growth. 35% have continued to growth, which is impressive. We look at their capital runway. You see 32% have more than 1 year of cash, which is very good. It's double what we've seen in the rest of Oceania and global. So this survey, as you can see, can highlight where are you doing better and where are your policies hit the mark to help them. So you can see the government New Zealand implemented really rapidly a 3-to-1 co-investment matching funding for angel investments. So $1 by a private angel investor, $3 by the government. So they used to be 1-to-1. It changed that very quickly at the beginning of COVID, and this is paying off. So this is the power also of having high velocity surveying of your startup ecosystem. And look at the change in labor cost, right? 81% have not changed much their labor cost. They were supported and they've kept their employees. That means out of the gate of the recession, they will be ready to play their role as economic recovery of the whole society in New Zealand. Much better than in the rest of the world. And again, we can see that fewer have closed, about half of the global average. So really good. And when we look at their policy, we can see you expect policies that have already announced to support your business. And you can see in New Zealand how many have answered yes, 64% versus 42% in the rest of in the whole world. Much better performance of policy. And then when you ask about what type of policy they want, because they've been supported in their funding, then they say, what we need at this point is demand generation. We need growth. Can you do procurement laws? Can you do some programs to help us? To get the government to help where the private sector contracts. And you can see the other ecosystem are still asking for funding. Right? So it's important for you to know what's happening in my ecosystem. Thank you, Adam.
Great. Thank you very much, JF. If you want, I can share my screen and continue on. from here. Okay, you can all see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep, beautiful. So following on from exactly from what JF was describing on utilizing data is really utilizing a global network as well in terms of learning from each other, learning from global peers. The way that we do this is in our global network. We connect all of our 70 plus global members together once a month virtually to connect with each other, to form partnerships, to discuss on global best practices. As you can see here, this is our global member map, which is really a mix of key national government stakeholders, state stakeholders, city stakeholders, as well as international organizations such as the World Bank. And bringing all these key stakeholders together, these key decision makers, to discuss on best case policy programs from all around the world that can then be transferred and implemented in other ecosystems. So really the key thing about this is learning from global peers, not so much on the successes, but on the policy failures and the way over the past 10 years at Startup Genome, us really finding the best impact, and the way that this happened is really conducting this in closed doors, where people having candid conversations. So this is our member meetings, as well as once all of our members together in person. Of course, this year wasn't able to happen due to COVID. So today we're very fortunate to have to really Bonjour Startup Montreal's role has been in developing the Montreal startup ecosystem, and how you have utilized COVID-19 impact insights, data and research to guide your efforts during the crisis. So I guess, Patrick, I'd love to hear from you if you could tell us a bit more about how you have used, how you use data in developing the Montreal startup ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me today. Since I'm not going to have any slides, you might want to switch to full screen moving forward, up to you.
Okay.
So, how we've used the COVID impact insight survey and the data, talk about that, but also talk about the network. It's first and foremost, we're part of a larger international network within Startup Genome, which has been a great help in the last 2 years in establishing the vocabulary, the methodology to have a clear clear insights and conversations with policymakers at all government levels. That has been truly helpful for us in Montreal, but also gaining some key insights and making key learnings with other members of the network, the Startup Genome network. And that's why I always hop on those calls when I can make it, because you get to have access to someone in Tel Aviv, someone in Amsterdam, someone in Singapore. It gives you different perspectives, and it brings also the ability to benchmark. And that's the second point I think is really, really important here, is the ability to benchmark on those key metrics, on capital, on talents and jobs, on operations, policies, policy impact, those key factors. How are we progressing versus the rest of the world, and ecosystems that are comparable to ours, right? To Montreal, for instance. So really, benchmarking has been very, very helpful. I can give you a bit of an insight here. We know that 63% of our startups have over six months of runway, versus I think the 30, and that's 37% that have less than 6 months. So I think we know we're in the right spot with that. We know that 35% have more than 1 year of runway, and that's up from 26% in April. So we're able to compare that data with the data from Startup Genome and internationally. How are we progressing? So we know that we're going in the right direction with that data point. For instance, we know that 24% of our startups didn't receive government assistance versus the 38% internationally, right? Which we took from your report. So we're able to compare that data and gain a better understanding of the impact of our policies. On the investment side, we saw a drop of 80% of investments from Q4 2019 to Q1 2020. So that looks a lot like the curve that you have in your graph in the drop of investments. So, you know, those, I'm giving you 3 examples here of data points that we're able to compare with your analysis. And that's been, you know, very, very insightful for us. So benchmarking obviously is a key aspect to how we've used the data from your report, specifically the ones from the COVID impact survey. You know, it also helps build a rationale around policy. You know, and it's important to be able to have a level of discussion that is the level that's required with policymakers. You know, they talk about jobs, they talk about economic impact, they talk about return, economic return. So we need to have the ability to track the data, to be able to have those high level discussions to influence policy. So I think that what we've gained in the insights from your survey is how to build that rationale as well. You know, why tech startups are important, and that's something that, you know, we've built on definitely in our rationale. Looking at the drop in private investments, the cost benefit of policy investments as well, defining goals for government. These are all key aspects that are part of the rationale in your survey that we've built upon to build our own locally. And also, you know, your key policy principles that we've looked at, you know, the allocation of a percentage of cash to VCs, angel investment match from government, and how should government support VCs as well. So all those aspects have been taken into account when we formulated, you know, recommendations to government. But also we've used a database, you know, for potential avenues to explore policies and with policymakers. You know, we've had numerous calls and Zoom meetings with policymakers from all 3 government levels in Canada, you know, federal, provincial, and municipal in Montreal. You know, and we got inspired from, you know, in that database from policies that were, you know, rolling out as we were designing these recommendations. They were rolling out in March, April, and May in other countries. You know, we took one example from Tel Aviv with their matching fund with investors. We looked at Germany, that covers 100% of the loans. So, you know, loan coverage, matching dollars for investments, other instruments, convertible loans. So these are all, like, you know, inspirations for us that we use to build our own recommendations for policies. So, you know, that's really what, you know, how we've worked with the data and the conversations we had as well in our meetings with the other Startup Genome members, right? So that's, it's been very helpful. Other perspectives, you know, you might have other questions, but
yeah. I guess, I mean, you touched on utilizing data. I mean, for your own organization, but how important is having data to kind of be at the center point of so many different ecosystem stakeholders when there's government at play, especially different levels of government at play. And then you have, I mean, all the private sector actors as well. What kind of insights and leverage and alignment capabilities does data give you when having all these different kinds of conversations?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, it helps us to prioritize prioritize the recommendations, for measures to implement. And the governments, all three levels of government have been very active since the beginning of the crisis. I have to, hand it out to them. They've been active and proactive as well, and reactive. They've been listening. They've been adapting their policies. So bringing data at that level of discussion has been key as well to help us hone in on the right measures to recommend. Right. It's been very helpful to look at policies in terms of cash flow. Cash flow has been one of the major concerns from entrepreneurs during the crisis, right? So what are the other measures that were implemented in other countries? What data can we have? Were we able to use to benchmark to be able to promote measures to support payroll, right? And also adapting criteria. We realize that the negative EBITDA, the profitability criteria is something that is oftentimes used by policymakers, and that's something that's a barrier we had to overcome. So leveraging the data from your reports has been helpful in that sense as well, to be able to look at what other measures can we implement that circumvent this barrier of profitability as a criteria. And a lot of startups didn't comply to these the first programs that were rolled out in March and April, and the federal government had to adapt, right? And they had to adapt their criteria to be able to capture some of those startups that didn't show profitability because they're in their first year, their second year of deployment. They have negative EBITDA. So how do you make sure that these these startups are also supported and have assistance from the government? So we've used data in that sense as well, supporting payroll, and also we looked at speed of execution. That's another data point that we also used, benchmarking with other countries, is the speed at which these programs were rolled out. Having access to cash for startups was key in this crisis. So loans through financial institutions, how much time did it take to roll those out? And we looked at what happened in other countries. So that's another data point that we also used to make our recommendations for policymakers. We also looked at your curated, your solutions database, the curated solutions, and the solutions database, and that also helped us in finding examples and again benchmarks that we could use to build our rationale. I'll give you an example. Bringing startups to help directly in the crisis. That's something that we honed in on, zoomed in on really rapidly in March, April, and we actually did a COVID challenge with a big financial institution here in Montreal, Desjardins. We launched a platform for challenges, for open innovation challenges, so that corporations could submit their challenges for startups to respond to. So that's another example of how we've benchmarked with some of the solutions that you had in your database. Grants, for the type of grants to support payroll. Also community. One thing that I realize is that bringing the community together was one of the solutions that you had in your database. And we really worked hard in terms of bringing the support organizations together during this crisis, and built task forces to work on specific measures that could help startups in the short term. We created a weekly webinars for entrepreneurs. We invited entrepreneurs to present their businesses, whether they were pivoting, whether they were hibernating, whether they were growing, to show some examples and to celebrate the successes, and also to understand the ones that were struggling. So bringing the community together has been very, very helpful and key in the last 5 months. So I'm giving you some examples of what we picked and choose from your different reports during the crisis.
Yeah. Thanks, Patrick. And I mean, looking to the future, I mean, as leading entities within Canada, OSMO and Bonjour Startup Montreal, can you tell us a bit about what you guys are doing, looking to the future, planning for the future, for the upcoming pivotal time over the next 3 months, and the next year or so to come?
So one thing that we're really, really keen on is bringing corporations to contribute in the recovery. Governments have a limited capacity to deploy assistance, and we think that corporations also have a role to play in the recovery. So we're getting we have several initiatives right now that we're working on to make sure that corporations will be involved in the short term, not in a year or two, but in the next 6 to 12 months, to be able to contribute, to benefit from their contributions in terms of doing open innovation, but also purchasing from local startups. Incentivizing these corporations to buy from local startups as well, and that's something that we're working on with government. We're forming policies that go in that direction, but we're also deploying programs for corporations to get involved and have incentives to get involved. Also working with government to see how we can accelerate the collaboration between government and startups, right? How do we make it easier for startups to deal with government? How do we overcome it? We've never had a better time today in the last 10, 20 years to change policies around government contracts and how they're attributed to the local economy, and how do startups participate in those government bids. So removing barriers in that sense is something that we're going to be focusing on as well. Getting government agencies to prototype with startups, and also we're going to continue working on helping startups liquidity situation or cash flow situation. But we think corporations can play a great role in that, in being their flagship client, and opening their international networks and distribution networks. So it's not just government, but we think also corporations can play a very big role in that sense. We're also going to push hard in connecting internationally our ecosystem. We think that despite this crisis that we're facing, that's stifling our initiatives to travel, to connect, we still need to make sure that we're going to be establishing strong ties with other key ecosystems that we want our startups to be connected to. So that's something that we're going to be working on over the next 6 to 12 months. And the other one is fill the talent gap. We're working. We need to invest in developing more talent in product management and growth engineering. So definitely working on that talent gap to help our startups grow. And lastly, I'd say we're working on Scaleup programs, different Scaleup programs, to make sure that we're converting our startups to hire to bigger SMEs, to scale-ups. So, and these programs are non-existent for now in Montreal, so we're working on those as well in the near term. So that gives you a rough idea of what are our priorities for over the next 6 to 12 months.
Thank you, Patrick. That's great.
Thank you very much. We only have a couple of minutes remaining on the webinar. So first off, thank you very, very much, Patrick, to hear your thoughts and what OSMO and Startup Bonjour Montreal is doing in response to the crisis and beyond, looking to the recovery as well. Thank you very much, JF, for joining us today. I will just share a couple of final slides that we have. And so basically the key takeaway from today's webinar is that, I mean, as we all know, COVID-19 has drastically affected our global startup ecosystem. Startups need to be understood and need responsive, targeted support. So we believe in hearing from your startups, understanding where they are, and enabling responsive action from policy leaders and from government leaders all around the world to enable your ecosystems to survive, which have been built over so many years. So we invite you to join our mission at startupgenome.com. And for any other questions related to our COVID-19 impact insights, here are my contact details on the screen. Please feel free to email or give me a call. I also would like to invite everyone to our next webinars on August 26th, which we will be having at the same time to allow for a global audience. So at 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. London time and 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. San Francisco time. And this topic will focus on multiplying ecosystem growth and policy impact. So a data-driven assessment in really prioritizing the gaps of your ecosystem and building a sustainable long-term ecosystem strategy. So for myself, thanks everyone for joining, and thanks again to Patrick for his time and for JF.
Thank you, Adam.
Thanks for your time, everyone. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, everyone.
Ciao.